Hello. Happy Easter to you if you're watching this on Easter Sunday. We are drawing to the end of our series on hope. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be focusing particularly on the last 2 chapters of John's Gospel and the hope that is revealed for us there. Next week, we're going to look at the hope of the Spirit, but today we're going to look at the hope of resurrection. Do you know, I think you could argue that resurrection is both one of the most important but least understood events in the Bible. In a sense, all of the New Testament builds up to what we're looking at today. If we look at the stories of the Gospels, there is this sense, I think, of this slow ascent towards Jesus's crucifixion and then rising from death. And then all of Acts and Paul's writing and all that stuff that came afterwards is then the early church working out what it means to them practically. And whilst I'm aware that a lot can and has been said on the intricacies of what the resurrection does or doesn't mean, for the next 10 minutes or so, I want to look just at what it meant for one person, and that was Mary Magdalene. Now, Mary Magdalene, we don't know much about her. In the previous chapter of John's Gospel, we're told that she was there at the cross when Jesus died. Some would say that perhaps she's the same Mary who sat and learnt from Jesus at his feet. Others argue she's the same Mary who was the sister of Lazarus. But what is true for John is that she was the first person to see Jesus in his resurrected form. So I'm going to read a few verses from John chapter 20. I'm not going to read it straight through because it's quite long, but I'm going to pick out some key moments for us. So John 20 opens with this. Early on the first day of the week, whilst it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and says, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." And then Peter and the other disciple, they went to the tomb, realised Jesus wasn't there, didn't really know what to do, and so they left. But Mary stood at the tomb crying. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "Truly, they've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." And at this she turned and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realise that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned around towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go instead to my brothers and tell them I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with this news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them these things he had said to her. So what do we learn from the resurrection in the eyes of Mary? Well, as it's our series on hope, I want to look at 3 hopes the resurrection offers. First of all, the resurrection offers a real hope. And what I mean by this is that as we read John's account of Jesus at this moment, it's clear that John is doing his utmost to describe a real world event. In other words, in the same way a newspaper writer today might include certain details to help their reader feel like they are living the scene, so John is including details to show his readers that he is describing something that really took place. He gives us the names of the different people who witnessed it so that if people had questions they could go and speak to them. He gives us the specific time it took place. He says it took place at the start of the first day of the week after Jesus' death. In the previous chapter, he gives us the exact location, and that it just took place in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And all of this, all these details, are to emphasize he is describing a real event. And I think sometimes when we speak of the resurrection, there is a temptation to make it unreal. The writer Tom Wright says this. He says, what we have at the moment isn't, as the old liturgies used to say, the sure and certain hope of the resurrection of the dead, but rather a vague and fuzzy optimism that sometimes things will work out in the end. Tim Keller, who I think I probably reference in every talk I give, he writes about when he had thyroid cancer. And as he was recovering from the treatment, not really sure how his life was going to pan out, he had this time on his hands. And so he decided to read a book by Tom Wright, funnily enough, called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And this is an 800-page tome exploring all the different historical background behind the resurrection of Jesus. And he said that Tim Keller, as a long-time pastor, preacher, Christian author, as he read this text, he says he came to realise that truly there is no historically viable alternative explanation for the birth of the early Christian church than the fact that these Christians thought they saw Jesus Christ and touched him, and that he was raised from the dead. And he said that as he read it, he realised he was coming to a greater certainty. And when he closed the book, he said in a way that felt very important at that time, that Jesus really, really, really did rise from the dead. We're going to, in a moment, come on to two much broader points about the resurrection. But it's worth saying, I think, that they only stand if at the centre, at the foundation of our faith, is a belief that Jesus really, really, really rose from death. So first of all, the resurrection offers us a real hope. Secondly, it offers us the hope of a new creation. One of the intriguing things about John's Gospel is how, even though he's writing about events from a particular time, about a particular group of people, he does so in a way that echoes a lot of the Old Testament. If you've got exceptionally good memories, you might remember with John chapter 1, we looked at some of the ways John echoed the very opening to the book of Genesis, the creation of the world. And apparently he does something very similar here. Now, I just want to say that what I'm about to say isn't my ideas. It's something I read from Tom Wright writing about this passage. And he makes the point that when John writes about Jesus' resurrection, he does so in a way that he is framing it as being similar to the creation story in Genesis. So, for example, in the creation story of Genesis, the world is created out of darkness. It says simply that darkness hovered over the surface of the deep. And when John describes the resurrection of Jesus, he describes how Mary arrived whilst it was still dark. In the Genesis story, we're told that human history began after 7 acts, if you like, of God's supernatural power. 7 events, if you like, creating the heavens and the earth, creating light and darkness. And similarly, across John's Gospel, we have 7 miraculous signs. The first being when Jesus turned water into wine. Later on, he fed 5,000. He healed an official's son. And then the 7th is Jesus's resurrection. 7 creative acts in Genesis, 7 miraculous signs in John's Gospel. In Genesis, we read that human history begins after 7 days of creation. In Jesus' resurrection, we read that Mary approached the tomb on the first day of the week. In the story of Genesis, we have God as the one presented as being the person who can bring can bring order out of chaos. And similarly, when Mary sees Jesus, she calls him gardener, someone who you could say their very job is to bring order out of the chaos of creation. And Tom Wright's point is that when John is describing this moment, he wasn't trying to present it as what he would call an odd or isolated supernatural event. It's not a kind of breaking in sign of God doing something he wouldn't normally do, but rather it was the beginning of a new world. That God was, to use Wright's words, unveiling the prototype of everything he will now do to accomplish his purpose in the world. This is the event that changes everything. In a sense, all our theology, all our belief, all our decisions, whether it's to do with prayer or worship or church or what job we should do or all that kind of stuff, we should view through the lens of Jesus's resurrection. In Romeo and Juliet, towards the beginning, when Romeo meets Juliet, he says these words to her. He says, "Call me but love, and I will be new baptized. Henceforth, I will never be Romeo." In a sense, what he's saying to her is, Juliet, if you tell me that you love me, I will leave everything behind. I will be new baptized. I'll be, if you like, born again. I'll have a different name. I'll leave behind my family, my friends, my livelihood, my life. And because of your love, I will be reborn as something new. I wonder if in a sense that is what the resurrection is. It is this point of things being remade. The question is how? Well, a lot could be said on that clearly, but I want to particularly look at it in the lens of the final type of hope the resurrection brings, which is a personal hope. How is this powerful new creation foreseen? Well, perhaps it's seen through the person of Mary. Do you know, I think we could spend a long time looking at Mary and why she was the first person to find Jesus in this way. In a male-dominated society at that time, where males would have led in government and men would have led the businesses and men would have led in the homes, the fact that God chooses a woman as the first witness of the resurrected Jesus is extraordinary. And we could say a lot about that. But I want to focus particularly on how Mary's encounter with Jesus at this point transformed her. Before she met Jesus, John says that she arrived in darkness. This is both a literal darkness, but I think also a darkness of not understanding what was happening. When she saw Jesus wasn't there in the tomb, her first reaction was to go and ask the other disciples whether they knew what had happened. When she didn't recognize Jesus, she asked him if he was the gardener, just to kind of see if he knew what happened. We know as well that before Mary was full of sorrow. We read that she was stood outside the tomb crying. And the fact that she was stuck there whilst where others had gone away showed perhaps she was lacking direction. She didn't know how to move on. But then afterwards, we read she is filled with joy. Her sorrow is left behind, and she is joyfully proclaiming Rabboni as she recognizes her teacher and Lord in the figure of Jesus. Where she was alone before, now she is reconciled. She's reconciled in her relationship with Jesus, but she's also at the end reconciled in her relationship with the disciples. Whereas before she didn't understand what was happening, now she really comes to faith as she says simply and prophetically, "I have seen the Lord." And whereas before she was directionless, now she is given this fresh purpose from Jesus as what I would argue is being his first evangelist. And what is the central point that links these two Marys? Well, it is her encounter with Jesus in his resurrected body. And at this point, I think two things are revealed to her. First of all, Jesus is God. He is the God of the world. He is the God who has control over creation, the God who can conquer sin and death and all things. But she also realizes that he knows her. It's extraordinary, I think, that the word that brings out, if you like, Mary's realization of who Jesus is her name. Earlier in John's Gospel, when Jesus speaks of being the Good Shepherd, he says, I'll call his sheep by name and they will follow me. And here we see that acted out, that Mary hears her name said by Jesus, and her response is to recognize him and follow him. So what does this all mean for us? Well, first of all, do we understand what it means to have a new beginning through the resurrection of Jesus? Do we believe that actually as Christians we have access to something that means we can leave behind the things that might draw us away from God and step into a new life living as his children? Sometimes it's so easy to feel dragged down by maybe the things that we do wrong or certain lies we believe about ourselves or all kinds of stuff. And yet the resurrection proves that we can step towards a new creation as God's child. There's probably stuff we could say here about how it's the now and not yet. It's something we experience, if you like, in part, but it's definitely something we can look forward to experience today and in future. But also, secondly, as we come to Easter, do we realise that Jesus knows our name? This same Jesus who conquered sin, death, who showed he had control over all creation, he knows us by name as well. I'm going to pray. Jesus, thank you that you are both the one who rules over all things, but you're also the one who knows us by name. And Lord, we pray, would you help us this Easter to draw courage and hope from the fact that you love us, you have a purpose for us, and you offer us a route to new life. Amen.